Very good. I'm pleased to introduce to you our speaker today. Reverend Dr. Gary Peluso-Verdend is President Emeritus of Phillips Theological Seminary. He began with Phillips in 1993. He served as a program director, the dean, development executive, president, and founding director of the Center for Religion in Public Life. For 5 years, between 2000 and 2005, he was the director of church relations at Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary in Evanston, Illinois. Gary retired from Phillips in February 2023. Gary is a retired ordained elder in the United Methodist Church as a part of the Northern Illinois Conference. And as you know, he attends Boston Avenue, where he teaches adult church school classes frequently. And he was recently named our theologian in residence. Gary serves on the board of the Oklahoma Center for Community and Justice and on working groups for the Braver Angels Alliance in Oklahoma and Compassionate Tulsa. The presentation today is an extension of the brunch talk that he gave this last year at the Barton Clinton Gordy Lectures. That talk was a result of digging through the Boston Avenue archives looking for interesting and unknown or under-examined stories. For the presentation today, he gets to focus on Pastor John Rice and Rice's unique liberal contribution to shaping Boston Avenue in the turbulent 1920s. So let us turn our attention now to Reverend Dr. Gary Peluso-Verdend.
Take a moment here to get hooked up. Which side the HDMI goes on?
Almost PhD. That's almost PhD. I'll have that.
Oh, it's on. We're okay. Then we're good. Yeah. And then I'll go to presentation mode. Learning about who John Rice was, I think, was one of the most, if not the most enjoyable part of the archive digging I did. You know, I was also looking for, you know, what was the church's involvement back at the time of the race massacre and other sorts of context. But John Rice's story is one that I found just absolutely fascinating. So I want to tell you a little bit about him. And again, this is an extension of some of the remarks I was able to make back in March, but this time with some much more context on who this guy was. So like most of your early pastors, John Rice was born in the South. He was actually born in 1862 in South Carolina. His dad was a well-known physician and scholar in that day. He was born on a plantation in 1862. I mean, when did the Civil War start? 1861. I mean, so he was born in the midst of the war, and slaveholding family on both sides. So, so they weren't poor white. It meant that they had wealth, or some wealth that he was born to. He quickly exhausted his local resources for being for education, and went off to college, and then seminary. He did his seminary at Columbia Theological Seminary, which is a Presbyterian school, and that's not unimportant. One of the professors he met there, a man by the name of it's James Woodrow, who is the uncle of Woodrow Wilson, and after whom the president was named. James Woodrow got into huge trouble in the Southern Presbyterian Church as one of the early advocates for how the Bible and science, in particular in regard to evolution, are not incompatible. In other words, that one could read the Bible as a faithful Christian and believe in evolution as the way God creates, and that caused both problems to Dr. Woodrow in the 1880s, and it caused a lot of trouble for John Rice in the 1920s, and we'll come up to that. He was married a first time and had children from that marriage. His wife died fairly early. His first wife died fairly early. When she died, it was interesting, John farmed out the children to relatives, and his oldest to an orphanage for a period of time, where he was one of the paying people at the orphanage, basically using it like a boarding house for the son. While Dad, John, took his almost doctorate, that's why I said almost PhD, his almost doctorate at the University of Chicago, which was in business less than a decade at that time when he went there. I've tried to find who his faculty were at Chicago, and one of the only ones I could find thus far, for sure, was Edgar Goodspeed, which those of us in seminary educated folks recognize as one of the great liberal New Testament scholars of that generation. He left Chicago, and it's nearly always a mistake to do this. He left to Chicago what's called ABD, all but dissertation, figuring that, well, along the way, he'll be able to work on his dissertation while he then was, as one of the most educated people in the Southern Methodist Church, was being given big pulpit after big pulpit, and he never finished that dissertation. He had 2 or 3 honorary doctorates, which is why he was often referred to as Dr. Rice, but not an earned doctorate, though I think in terms of Boston Avenue's history, he came closest to an earned doctorate that any of the clergy yet have had. So he, after his time in Chicago, he actually was president at a college for a period of time. It started out as a women's college, and he under his leadership became co-ed, and was an advocate for women in education, women having an education at a time when that was considered a very progressive point of view, and then had several large pulpits he went to, including in South Carolina and then in St. Louis, before being called to a brand new a school of theology at Southern Methodist University that became Perkins. In 1920, he was the founding professor of Old Testament at Perkins. About the same time, he published a book called The Old Testament and Life of Today, which immediately upon its publication drew fire mostly from people who didn't read it. In particular, a Southern Baptist pastor in Texas who went after him. And then, there was the so-called fundamentalist modernist controversy. This was like 1900 to 1915, where this oil magnate who was behind several evangelical causes with a brother-in-law published something called The Fundamentals, which was all against any modern critical work on the Bible. It was all against all of the Bible and science sort of things. It was give us the old Bible and only the Bible, and so the literal interpretation of Jesus and the virgin birth, and for bodily resurrection, and for things that were being challenged by some of the biblical scholars even in that day. They put out the fundamentals, and they pamphlets, and they sent it out to every church in the United States, and everybody that they could identify. I mean, they spent millions of dollars getting these out there. So that's the era, and the Presbyterians had their heresy trials starting in the late 1880s, and this James Woodrow was amongst them, his professor at Columbia. We Methodists were not, while we didn't have some of the most publicity-worthy heresy trials, there was a group of Methodists who believed the same way that the fundamentalists believed, and they came after John Rice. After a year of being at SMU, John decided that his work had become a distraction at the university. It was also the case there were some very conservative people on the board of trustees who were threatening to withdraw funds at that time. John also was pro-labor, which got him in trouble. We actually have in our archive, we have John's letter of resignation from SMU. We also have the school's response to that. And we have several of his colleagues who wrote about, especially in years afterwards, in fact, it's after John's death, and we have a collection of some of that in the archive. So you can see the conversations going on and that what all the political matters were, part of which was that John wrote this book on the Old Testament, and he said there were two things that the fundamentalists really hated. One is that the 6 days of creation could be understood metaphorically rather than literally. And secondly, that this is called the documentary hypothesis, that Moses didn't hand the first 5 books of the Bible, of our Old Testament, the Torah. He did not hand that to Joshua, as Moses said, I can't go in the promised land, Josh. You're going to be leading the people now. Here are the 5 books, live by them, and all. As for instance, the Ten Commandments movie showed him doing. Rather than that, they're saying no. There was 4 different editors. The documentary hypothesis by a German theologian by the name of Wellhausen, who said, there were 4 different editors. Using different names for God. You got 2 creation stories. You got the Deuteronomist, who's different from all the rest of the other ones who were writing. And he said that these were the things he said that were objectionable to the fundamentalists. On the board at Perkins was, of course, the resident bishop of the area, Bishop Edwin Muzan, who was as I'm doing some teaching last spring and going into this fall and some Sunday school classes, we're looking at Bishop Muzan's sermon that he gave on the Sunday after the race massacre here, because we do have the fullness of that sermon. It was published. But Bishop Muzan was a supporter of John Rice. He was theological, so that meant that Muzan himself was kind of theologically liberal, despite the fact that his beliefs on race relations were pretty much Southern Methodist, separate but equal, need to keep in our own lanes, live side by side but not together, and all that was common in that era. So Bishop Muzan felt sympathy for the way that Southern Methodists treated John Rice. He gave him a soft landing coming out of the university to appointed him to the church in Okmulgee for 1 year. And then he appointed him to Boston Avenue, where John served from about 1922 or thereabouts, 23 until 27. The new building was just being underway, and it happened. All the planning for that happened with John Rice as pastor here. But he was moved at a strange time, right as construction is starting. He spent a year as the editor of the Oklahoma Methodist newspaper, and then a startup congregational church here in Tulsa that doesn't exist anymore. And I've checked with Chris Morrow over Fellowship Congregational, and I talked to him about this story. He says, I never heard this one. And he thought he knew everything about the history of Congregationalists in Tulsa. This congregational group hired John and absolutely adored him because of John's liberal theological perspective. Now here, John Rice, liberal theological perspective at Boston Avenue, a church of the Southern Methodist connection, in the 1920s. You can imagine that his reception at Boston Avenue might not have been as unambiguously adoring as what it was in this fledgling congregational group. So I'm going to get into that now as I talk about John and his work here. But I want to give you some flavor of him first. So one of John's sons, his oldest in fact, became a founder of a small college, Black Mountain College, I think it was called, and wrote a book that was a biography, autobiography basically, about his own growing up years, where he included parsonage stories, things about his dad. Most of us who have kids who are clergy and we're clergy, we don't want our kids writing stories about the parsonage. Because there's a whole lot that goes on that most congregants would never know and just don't need to know. And I'm going to give you a couple examples of that out of John Rice Jr.'s book. He talked about his dad's after church routine on a Sunday. Said before he could eat his dinner, his Sunday dinner, he had to take a bath and change his clothes. For he always came out of the pulpit, winter as well as summer, dripping wet with sweat. Not perspiration, there's too much of it to be called by that polite name. In his early years of preaching, he did not know how to control his voice and made of it the wonderful organ that it was afterwards became. He began, as other evangelical preachers did, at something higher than conversational pitch, and as feeling soared upward, his voice soared with it until the rafters rattled in their joints. When he was in full flight, he could be heard blocks away as he roared and mopped and mopped and roared. His handkerchiefs were sopping wet out of his pockets, and sometimes the back of his Prince Albert, the kind of coat he had on, was a streak of black, darker black than where the sweat came through. Herodotus tells of a king who complained to his wife because she never told him of his haliotopic condition. She explained that she thought that that was the nature of men. I thought that my father was the nature of preachers until a few years later, when I'd become a college president and I could go wandering and sampling elsewhere. I found my way into a Presbyterian church and was amazed to see the man could praise the Lord without a drop of sweat or even perspiration. Then this was really interesting, because remember, he grows up on a plantation in South Carolina, but after the South lost the war, which meant for a lot of plantation owners, they didn't know how to carry on afterwards, and they didn't have the wealth that they had prior to. So he comes out of more of a country, and his son would even say a country bumpkin kind of setting. And he has to learn to adjust to the culture of the place where he is, to his congregations. And it's very interesting what he says, what John says about his dad. He never wore new clothes without self-consciousness, nor old clothes without a sense of inferiority. That is, he was not an aristocrat, was not born in the aristocracy, and had no natural aptitude for its graces. But he wanted to be. I often heard him say, I should like to have been a gentleman. But he could not be a gentleman because he had no gracious tolerance of the past, which was always called upon by him to defend itself with a statement of purpose. He was never at home in any world, and the gentleman has at least one world, however specious, in which he is at home, as has presumably the saint. He had something of them both in him, but not enough of either to bring him security. Now, he didn't say a word about him being at Boston Avenue. And John Jr. was grown up and on his own by the time that John Rice came here. Remember, he was born in 1862, came here about 1922-ish, so he was 60 when he came here. In later years, when he became pastor of rich congregations, he was always awkward in their social affairs, and awkwardness in the uncertain civilization of the Middle West was unforgivable. There were no more aristocratic than he was. They were trying to learn how to form an aristocracy. I got quite a surprise in St. Louis when I found out that one might be in the social register and the Methodist Church at the same time. Meanwhile, when they were uncertain as to a point, they looked it up. He was at length persuaded to buy a dress suit, but he was not instructed and did not bother to find out the rules as to the time of wearing, never before 6 o'clock, and made his first appearance in it at afternoon tea. Many souls were lost to the kingdom on that day. From these clashes with the world of fine people, he came away always angry and hurt. Fashionable weddings in particular upset him for days, but he took a mad delight in marrying off plain, simple people and would go to any lengths to help them out. A little bit on his background. Now, and before I get into the specifics of him in Boston Avenue, here's something from a couple of his sermons. We have a number of his sermons in the archive. There's in fact a set of red volumes that are sermons that he preached over his time here. He had a secretary who, as he was preaching, typed word for word what it is she heard, and then had them mimeoed and could hand them out for like 10 cents a piece to the congregation afterward. And so he also had then a number of them that were made off prints so that they could be handed out at various conferences and things. He was speaking all over the country. This is from his sermon on Jesus and evolution. It says, I am indebted to Professor Chase for a resolution I hold in my hand, passed by the Lancaster, Ohio School Board in 1828, when my father was 18 years old. And I commended to the very careful attention of Dr. Claxton and Brother Courtney in the School Board of Tulsa. See, at the time, in the 1920s, there was controversy in the state legislature as to what should be taught in schools. Brother Claxton was the school superintendent for the Tulsa Public Schools, under fire from the State Board of Education. They've never heard of these things before, right? He was also a member here, Dr. Claxton was. This is the superintendent. So anyways, this is from 1828, from a congregation in 1828, that said, you are welcome to use the schoolhouse to debate all proper questions in, but such things as railroads and telegraphs are impossible and rank infidelity. There is nothing in the Word of God about that. If God designed that his intelligent creature should travel at the frightful speed of 15 miles an hour per speed, he would have foretold it by the mouth of his holy prophets. It is a device of Satan to carry the soul of the faithful down to the hell. Dr. Rice goes on, says, about the middle of the last century, it was claimed that the use, which would have been middle of the 1800s, it was claimed the use of anesthetics in childbirth was against the Bible, since children must be born in pain. I could go on for hours, he said, illustrating the folly of going to the Bible for science. Now, that is all past history, but there's pending before the legislature of Oklahoma today, under the influence of 3 corporations well-financed outside of Oklahoma, a bill to foist their particular prejudices about religion upon us and our children. He says, all I mean by evolution, for I know nothing about it as a science, is creation by growth, making over all things into new things, making over old forms into new forms, making over old life into new life, growing out of the old into the new. I see him doing it when he makes a tree, when he makes a plant. That is the way he made me. That is the way he made you. That is the way he made every race that we know anything about. That is the way he makes every animal, every blade of grass, every living thing, period. He is making things that way everywhere. Creation is still going on. And then from his sermon on what science has done for my religion. Science has given me a satisfying worldview. When I was born, the universe was supposed to have been created in 6 days, 6,000 years ago. Professor Lightfoot of Cambridge proved to his own satisfaction the world was created at 9 o'clock Thursday morning, the 23rd of October, 4004 BC. I felt the perfect backbone of a fish the other day, so old, two scientists present, when asked its age, replied the question was like asking how many seconds I had lived. We now go back, no one knows how many millions of years, or billions even. You see how science keeps evolving, because we know about, the Earth being, nearly 4 billion years old, and the universe either 13.8 billion, or some scientists are saying what the Webb telescope is now showing, it might be double that. So that, all this interesting stuff going on. And everywhere order prevails. Nature has its universal rhythms. Its laws prevail without fail. Yet these laws are but the way one thing follows another, and all things are not a crystal, but a stream. Not a finely fixed entity, but an endless process of becoming. This gives us light on the origin of evil. It's one thing to think of God creating by divine fiat instantly all things, man included, perfect, and upon man's fall, all things, man included, tumbling back into the godless deep from which God has ever since been seeking to redeem us. It's another thing to think of God as creating by slow processes of tireless struggle through countless eons, carrying the universe towards some far-off ideal. This, then, is not the best possible world yet. Man that fell upon becoming self-conscious and has staggered all the way along is nevertheless moving with God toward a yet unachieved self. It's taken God 1 million years to make a feather regarded as amongst the most perfect of his products. Creation by growth is the method I now see him using every day. And he is inviting us to share his creative work, period, in the light of evolution, which is only creation by growth. All our ills take on a new meaning, being the birth pangs of a new order, and all experiences pass into a new perspective. Our utopia is where the prophets and apostles put it, far on in front. So that's a little bit of John Rice's background, a little bit of personality and all. And I already went through this, that he was widowed, University of Chicago, got remarried. His second wife, by the way, was hugely important even beyond John's death here in Tulsa, to the Tulsa public school system, where first she taught on a volunteer basis and then was actually a paid staff person in the Tulsa public schools doing parent education. She was an early advocate of mothers and fathers learning to parent better. And there's a whole other story about her that is yet to be told, I think. And a lot of reading to do, because she also wrote some incredible curriculum. So, John Rice spoke openly about his evolution from the pulpit. He was one of the 2 or 3 pastors in Tulsa who would talk about evolution. Remember in 1925, there was a very famous national event called the Scopes Trial, oftentimes also known as the monkey trial. Did we descend from monkeys? Which evolution never said. No scientist has ever said. So he preached quite openly about his beliefs about evolution. And in the Tulsa Tribune of the day, it said, from July 1925, Dr. John A. Rice, pastor of the Boston Avenue Methodist Episcopal Church, who expressed views in a talk before the Lions Club Thursday of a modernist character, and said that a thinking man had long ceased to take as literal the story of creation in 6 days, is not supported on that point by a majority of members of his church board who were interviewed upon the question. Decidedly, the majority of Dr. Rice's congregation are fundamentalists. If the views of leading churchmen interviewed are conclusive, Only one declared himself an evolutionist, and he took the viewpoint there is no conflict in the two theories. Two others were somewhat liberal in their view, but tended towards fundamentalism. The rest supported strongly the faith of their fathers, as outlined in the Bible, free from modernist alterations or concessions. So he was preaching something that was controversial within his own church community. And some of the people interviewed, I will tell you, we know to be some leading members of the congregation. I've read from you what he said evolution means, meaning that basically creation is still ongoing. Evolution, he understood it not as necessarily a scientific theory, even though he wanted to say that science and religion are not at all necessarily incompatible, but that God creates through the process of evolution. That was one of the controversies that he had here. John was, after 5 or 6 years, was moved from Boston Avenue in 1927, which is 2 years before the building was finished. He had health issues at the time, and he had some that were quite serious health issues. And it was allegedly said that they needed a younger and stronger man, quote unquote, to finish the fundraising for the building. And this is when Pastor Reeves became the pastor then, when John Rice moved on first again to the Methodist newspaper, and then became the pastor of the Congregational Church, which he served for 2 years before, after 2 surgeries and developing cancer, he died. So he died in June of 1930. He was, however, there were a couple of things. One is there were people here who really did not like John Rice. And even at one point importuned the bishop to move him. And they made it sound as if the entire congregation was opposed to him. Well, when one of the leaders of the pro-John Rice group found out what they were going to do, the bishop was at annual conference. They had all their supportive members telegraph the bishop to say, we support our pastor. And it was through that John actually stayed at the church at that point in time, rather than getting moved by those who opposed him. The opposition was serious, and when Audrey Cole, one of the lead members of the building committee and wife of the head of the building committee, C.C. Cole, C.C. standing for Christopher Columbus Cole, I always look at. She said that the congregation wore him out, especially the opposition. From when Audrey Cole wrote a publication we have called The Story of the New Church, she said, to begin with, we are most fortunate in having as our pastor Dr. John A. Rice, a profound scholar, a seer, a man who has reached such spiritual heights, he suffers with aloneness. Here's some of that in even John Rice's, his son's recounting of his dad and the recovery necessary after meetings and sermons and the like. He was not a natural glad-hander. at all. He was first and foremost, in fact, a scholar. So it said, he it is who uncovered the smoldering desire of the congregation for a new church. Remember, John didn't start, John preached at this church in this pulpit on its consecration Sunday. But we have elements of that sermon at least. Where he was preaching was our Fifth and Boston location. He it is who uncovered the smoldering desire of the congregation for a new church, desire buried for years under a mass. Get this, a desire buried for years under a mass of indifference, fear, and selfishness. He fanned that desire till it glowed in active determination. She also said Dr. Rice had been in Europe a year or so before the church was started. He had returned convinced of one great truth, that continental Christianity is not for us. He said that we need most is a new set of symbols to express our modern Christian ideals. He and Miss Robinson, of course, Ada Robinson, had many interesting discussions over that phase of the work. When they agreed, it was delightful, and when they agreed, it was delightful to hear them. When they differed, it was fascinating as lightning. It was the two of them together, Ada Robinson as the artistic designer and John Rice as the theological voice, who dreamed of what this church building would become. In his Message of the Modern Church, when I said at the Barton Clinton Gordy, I said that evolution is embedded in this building. John Rice's beliefs about evolution are embedded in this building, which includes, by the way, with the flower themes that run through here as part of God's creation, rather than other kinds of traditional religious iconography. From John Rice's sermon, his Message of the Modern Church, he said, as it has been stated, we wanted evolution, creation through growth, to be the key idea. There are panels left in the foyer where the evolution of religion itself from its primitive beginning will be traced in terms of worship to its culmination in the conversation of Jesus with the woman at the well. And this was an understanding of what was going to happen, I think, in the Great Hall. There was to be murals starting that would come along there. But again, evolution. Then it says, then in a great social corridor, it is which is that Great Hall, it is expected the history of Christianity itself will be traced up to Protestantism, through Protestantism to Methodism, then through Methodism the division of North and South, closing with the suggestion of hope that the two will become together again. Remember, that wasn't until 1939 that Methodist Church North and South came back together. And the problem with having done that evolutionary mural, if they had done it, is, and what are you going to do in 2023 as the church is not hanging together at this point in time? So evolution, creation to grow to be the key idea through that kind of iconography. William Bowie was a layperson here who, when John Rice went to the Congregational Church, went with him there, liked him so much. Bowie was one who was trying to respond to one of John Rice's colleagues at Southern Methodist University, who, after John's death in the late 1930s, was trying to put together what exactly happened at Southern Methodist that John got kicked out, and what was the experience here. In fact, did John lead this church because so many people opposed his liberal theology? And so he was writing Mrs. Cole and others at that point in time, including William Bowie. William Bowie said, on an occasion, Dr. Rice called me into a conference requesting me to make current, earnest effort to develop a modern program for use after we moved in the new edifice. I think Louis was the head of the Sunday school, which he should be keeping with the modern architecture. You know, speaking of the great edifice that he helped plan, in fact, it was his spirit that was behind the architect, by which he means not Bruce Goff's firm, but Ada Robinson. It was his idea to get away from what he called the heathen architecture, which to him represented paganism more than Christianity. Miss Ada Robinson, the architect, artistic designer, worked with him closely and readily caught his spirit. In looking at a picture of the building, you will be struck by the fact that the type of the structure is all open, as if it were living something which is reaching up towards heaven. He said at one time it also represented open-mindedness. How many times he warned his congregation about the kind of teaching that should be done in that building, that otherwise the building would mean nothing, and that it could be in fact a mockery of the truth. From probably what was the inaugural sermon for this building, Rice praised it, praised the greatness of the architecture. But all this cannot make a church. These wonders may increase all the more to futility of a hollow sham. Is it not to provide creative conditions for fulfilling the task Jesus gave his disciples, and through them to us, the task namely of bearing witness to him? By common consent, the witness is to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. It is a very poor sort of church that will not face the truth and give it to the world at any cost. No matter how many idols it smashes or how many hearts it breaks, it must tell the whole truth. In this time of religious self-complacency on the one hand and marvelous material expansion on the other, there must be a return to the old-time realities. We need more hellfire and damnation expressed in modern terms from courageous people who have the manhood and womanhood to hear, to tell what they hear and live by it. The burning question of this hour is whether the prophet can have any place in institutionalized religion. The institution needs support. Shall we run the risk of alienating supporters by telling the truth? Never a more withering slogan blighted a congregation than peace at any price. We have misrepresented Jesus with our theories and theologies till we have concealed the real Christ. We would see Jesus. This is in our archive here, a reflection letter, again by Audrey Cole, responding to that former colleague of Dr. Rice's who was trying to write a biography of him, and she said, Dr. Rice was a prophet, thinking so far ahead of his time that he was stoned figuratively, if not literally, by many of his members who at the present time would be shocked if they were reminded of it. They've grown unconsciously, outgrown their old beliefs as a result of his teaching. Dr. Rice's influence was widespread in our city outside of the church. He had an earnest following among the intellectual leaders of the city. His ideas were always stimulating and contagious to the open-minded. When she reflected then on the first 50 years of Boston Avenue, Audrey Cole said, enthusiastic as he was, Dr. Rice was not able to see the difficult building period through to the end. His health failed. How much it was due to his fight against ignorance and prejudice, we shall never know. So he was made editor of the Oklahoma Methodist, and a younger and stronger man was sent to the helm of Boston Avenue, which, by the way, one of the reflections from one of the people who knew the situation said, when Reeves came as the pastor, he came under the influence of those who were John Rice's opponents. And Rice's contributions to this church and community were suppressed for a number of years and time. And one of the reasons I thought it was great to read what I was reading here and try to bring them out some again is that I think this is a story that we're telling. In closing, and then we got about 15 minutes or so for questions. I love this from Winston Churchill. You know, we shape our buildings and afterwards our buildings shape us. We sit in a building that could not be confused with Orthodox architecture from that era. That you can basically look at First Methodist and the kind of Gothic construction. Well, that's what a church is supposed to look like. And all. The kind of stuff that Rice said, well, that's pagan, it's heathen. It's what Europe did as they looked backwards. We should be looking forwards. And so this merger of the kind of Gothic with Art Deco and with the Art Deco and the craftsman sort of using organic shapes and all, shapes and things is very much who we are. And Louis and Cole both talking about the open-mindedness and the reaching up and the sense of openness towards the sky and towards what more is to come. That's what we're built into. So how much of Boston Avenue's ongoing life is shaped by the ideas that shaped this building? That's a great question. So I'm happy to entertain your questions, comments. Yes?
You mentioned that he came after the construction was started. No.
No, he left as construction started.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, he was reassigned right before construction started.
Okay, so when he came, they weren't planning a new.
They were not.
Okay.
They were not. In fact, as Audrey Cole was saying, it was while there was some desire there, it was underneath a lot of indifference or she's called it indifference, fear, selfishness. I mean, she had some strong words to say about her fellow congregants at that point in time. It was real interesting.
He was clearly an iconoclast, ahead of his time. What's amazing is that they didn't run him off sooner. So there were elements within the church that shaped also where we finally wound up. Absolutely.
And if he didn't have the backing that he had of the Cole family, I'm not sure where he'd be. But I think their backing was incredibly important for him being able to survive it here for the years that he did.
And what you're saying is theoretically possible that someone who comes into this building looking for orthodox opinions, feelings, and beliefs may feel threatened by this building itself.
I think that is the case. It's theoretically possible, yes. One of the illustrations I love in this business about we shape our buildings and afterwards our buildings shape us is the old TV show The Beverly Hillbillies, right? Where so much of the joke, so much of the humor was around taking from the hills of Kentucky and then bringing those habits into their Beverly Hills mansion. And while they adjusted some to the mansion, they definitely had the mentality of Granny doing lye soap at the cement pot and the like and all. So and how many? I mean, and for how many people? And I'm sure this is part of the issue that Boston Avenue has over time, is that if you grew up in Boston Avenue, this is what church is.
Amen.
Right? And so then you look at that when you go to a church that's the now average Methodist church with 35 in worship, a church built, whether it's an old suburban, a suburban church built in the 1960s with the upside down bow of the boat architecture, the laminated beam thing that was all over the place in the 60s, whether you go there or whether you go to the country church that was built, late 1800s, early 1900s, where they were still debating in the 1960s and 70s whether they ought to have an indoor privy. And all, you go there, you say, well, that doesn't feel like church. And the opposite, people who grew up in one of those churches coming here was like, wow, I'm gonna have to get used to this. This is different. So theoretically, I think so, yeah.
When you were mentioning Audrey Cole, I was remembering when Roger Coffey came and spoke to us, and he had a printed flyer that had pictures and the names of all of that original administrative board. Were they all in agreement, or have you read anything? Because they were outstanding names in Tulsa, and they seemed to be all very progressive. But were all of them along with Audrey, or have you seen any, were they a united group of supporting Dr. Rice?
From what I remember, and I'd have to research it to say for sure, but from what I remember, no, it wasn't entirely supportive of Dr. Rice. And here's the other thing. I mean, so yeah, there were enough, and there were contributions coming in, and I've seen some of the. I mean, we had one of the documents we uncovered was the first subscription list, because that's what they called it back then. Was you subscribe to a budget. This first subscription list for the first $300,000 or whatever it was for the what became the $1.2 million building at the time, and there were a lot of the heavy hitters in town. There were the McFarlands and the like, Chapmans who were part of that. But the other thing I wanted to say, and this is one of the unknowns for me about Dr. Rice and the church at the time. So we have a nice biography that was the kind of biography of Rice that during the time he was here, if he was asked to speak elsewhere, and they said, give us your photo on the bio, and they send that. So we have that nice 3 or 4 page, pretty well-defined biography. And what's so interesting about it, which some of the detail is such that Dr. Rice had to have written it himself. There's comments in there about science, and there's comments in evolution, and comments in there about support for women, and there isn't a word in there about race. And I've read about 20 of his sermons now. There's been one time he talked about the possibility of peace and brotherhood in regard to race, but I don't find anything else. So I'm wondering if there was more than one third rail, so-called, for preaching here. One of my favorite questions to ask when I'm asking about the culture of a congregation is what, if mentioned in a sermon, would get a preacher in trouble around here? And it may be that evolution was less, and the Bible is less controversial than having said something about race in the 1920s. Remember where the congregation was in 1921? Standing and applauding everything Bishop Mouzon had to say the night when Mouzon said the race riot needs to be blamed on the combination of the lawlessness that people in charge let to go on in North Tulsa, and black people not staying in their place and believing that there could be actual equality between the races. And that was pretty much a standard sort of point of view for Southern Methodism at that point in time. So you could be progressive when it comes to science and the Bible, but not necessarily by any modern understanding progressive when it came to race. And I don't know what the perspective was with Rice on race, but that is It's something that when I have a little bit of time, I'm going to dig through a few more of his sermons and see if I can find any more writing on it, because I can't see where you commented much. Yeah, so a genuinely liberal pastor here, 1920s, mixed reaction to. But the person whose theological vision will shape this building.
Wasn't that wonderful? Well, thank you all again for being here. Check out all the different offerings we have for the fall. Hope to see you more often. And let's stand for our benediction. And we go forth from this time together renewed in spirit and in our souls for all that we are as Boston Avenue Church in the ways that we are able to support, enrich, and be together in God's name. We ask that we go forward to spread that word and to be examples of kindness and love and generosity to all we meet. And we pray these things in your Son's name. Amen. Amen. Thank you all. Yay.